Thank you, and hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here today to share with you some of my experiences, some of my ideas, and hopefully there'll also be some time for you to also engage with each other and in the question section afterwards, because I'm looking forward to hearing from you as well. The conversations I've already had on some of the breaks have been with really interesting. So I always enjoy going to conferences that attract really interesting people, and I get the sense that this is one of those. So well done. So I would say I'm standing here today. I didn't actually get to hear Marcus's presentation because I don't speak Swedish, so I skipped that. So I do understand he also talked a little bit about complexity. So I hope I won't duplicate that. I'll do my best. But I did get to hear some of Joe Justice's speeches, and I would say probably my experiences are exactly the opposite. I've worked in, you could say, the exact opposite types of situations that you've had the privilege of working in. My career has been a long series of working in very large, very integrated, to the point of almost being paralyzed global organizations. I started my career working at Maersk in the US, the big shipping company that's headquartered in Copenhagen, and that brought me to Europe 18 years ago. And I was working on projects with them for around 10 years and working in other very large global corporations after that. So I wish I could stand here and say I've managed successful projects for the past 18 years, and I'm going to tell you how. But I'm actually here to tell you I've suffered being part of extremely failing projects for around 15 out of the last 18 years. And I'm here to share with you some of the things I've learned along the way, that maybe some of which resonate with you, and in that journey, the ways I tried to acquire new building blocks and tried to make sense of things. And I hope some of this will be useful for you. So thank you for being part of it. What I currently do is act as a consultant, helping teams solve better problems better. And I would say 98% of my work is usually actually rescoping problems that I've come into that have actually been misdiagnosed. And I help teams work together better to be able to move coherently towards their shared intentions. So I want to start by telling you a story of my first kind of what started me on this learning journey with Maersk many years ago. We were doing a global SAP implementation, and it was going to be standard. I see some people nodding their heads. I think we all suffered through this in the last decade, right? And they were going to roll a standard solution out, and there was going to be no local configurations, and if anybody had a problem with that, they needed to be change managed. And because they were clearly opposed to change. And I was sitting in the US at the time, and the people who designed the solution were in Copenhagen, and they designed a global solution without talking to us. And when they came to roll it out in the US, where we have a completely different intermodal structure than they have in Europe, and we had completely moved on from the legacy systems that they were supposedly replacing like decades before, and they didn't know this. When we resisted, because it simply wouldn't work, the global solution that they had, they just labeled us as being normal Americans that think they know better, which is partially, of course, not untrue. And then they told us, you know, too bad, do this anyway, so we had to use workarounds and kind of survive. Then I moved to Spain, experienced the same situation. Then I finally got a job in Copenhagen where I was going to come and be part of the problem. And I was going to be the solution architect that was in charge of the solution for the globe. And we were going to finalize our $1 billion implementation of SAP in Denmark. And I was responsible for part of it. And I was sold this job by being told that I had the final authority on the solution, no matter what. This didn't end up being the case because it turned out the solution didn't work in Denmark either. Our global solution that was designed in Denmark. And I tried to explain this to the leadership, me and my colleagues, the solution architects, and they didn't care. They had more stripes on their shoulder, and they didn't care about our opinions, which were very much based in facts. And they went live anyway. And so within a month, we weren't able to pay our vendors. And within a year, they pulled the plug on the whole $1 billion implementation and declared it a failure and tried to do a retrospective to figure out what went wrong and discovered that the solution didn't work for the people that had been screaming the solution didn't work all these years. And the interesting thing, the saddest part of the whole story, isn't that SAP couldn't work. I mean, that's debatable. Let's have that conversation over coffee. It wasn't because SAP couldn't work. It was because people had interpreted standard as meaning you can't configure anything. And in reality, those of you who have worked with it realize that there's a standard SAP possibility of things that you can configure, and configuration is still within the standards, but the people working with it didn't understand this, so they made one way of using it and tried to push that at everybody. And so we could have actually been successful with SAP if we had understood these kind of simple things, but we didn't. So I disgruntledly leave Maersk thinking, oh, it's the culture. And I've also since heard this dialogue, this narrative in every organization I work in, that it's just us. It's our culture. What can we do? But I've worked in probably 20 companies now, either as an internal or as a consultant, and everyone thinks it's just us. But there's something special about when people come together and try to do something at scale, that things get really tricky. That is a little bit less tricky, which is why it's so brilliant what you described this morning about the modularization. Because if you can modularize things, then of course you decrease the complexity, you decrease the integration points. So in an ideal world, if you have the abilities of Elon Musk to go in and say, I'm doing it this way, that's great. But in the situations I work in, we don't have this character. So when I went on to thinking it was the culture and I went to other companies, I started to realize, well, maybe it's because we're not using Agile. And I had started playing with Agile, and back in those days it wasn't as popular. And I was thinking, okay, well, learning with the solution in context is good. Let's bring that faster to the user. This is going to solve our problems. And in some contexts, I've seen it work, but what then ended up happening was by the time we tried to scale Agile in the organizations, we kind of started suffering from the same exact paralysis that we were suffering from in the linear solution design phases, because people became kind of slaves to the process. People would spend hours and hours rediscussing the roles of Scrum Master and the roles of what should we do in this ritual. And it became just almost felt a bit psychotic at times, how much we had to discuss Agile and what we were going to do. And we became kind of suffocated by the method instead of actually having the space to talk about the quality, which is what Agile intended to give us when it helped us understand working with complexity. So then I became even more fascinated in, okay, maybe it's just big business, maybe it's just big companies. So I went and worked in startups, innovation hubs in the universities. I've been working at startup hubs for years. And I've also seen tendencies, even in small teams, to make the same mistakes of deciding which problem they're solving before they've actually gotten a proper understanding of the problem. So that made me really curious to understand on a more meta level what's going on with how we think about problems and how we think about solving them. So that's where my research, I've been independently researching and studying under complexity scientists for the past 5 years, and I've kind of put this together into hopefully what is a blend of like a layperson's guide to complexity working in corporations, and I'm going to share some of this with you now. So I want to look at it through the lens of efficiency. I kind of tried to be a little bit, I don't know, provocative by saying useful inefficiency, because recently I feel like people around me are worshiping efficiency. Maybe it's because we talk about AI so much. I've been to a lot of conferences, and a lot of people, when they talk about AI, they're only talking about how much efficiency gains we have. Thank you, by the way, for that not being what we dominated the conversation with today. I saw a guy posting on LinkedIn last weekend on Friday saying we should all take the day off today because of all the efficiency gains we've made because we've used AI this week. And I thought, yeah, okay, and I'm going to go out to dinner with all the money I've saved by not smoking. But it doesn't actually really work that way. I haven't personally experienced that my efficiency suddenly piles up and all this extra time is on my hands. But we do love efficiency, and we most notice when efficiency is missing, right? When you're in a situation and you expect it to work, like you're on a plane and you don't want to have to be like, hey, would it be an idea that maybe we could do drinks? We could get drinks on the plane. You don't want to have to reinvent processes that should work and can be optimized. If you're in a hospital and you're having a surgery, you want to know that the surgeons aren't having a divergent brainstorm about what they think they should do to operate on you. You want them to feel pretty confident that they've got that process under wraps. But you also want the doctor to be able to notice if there's something contextually fishy about the situation and be able to say, wait a minute, despite all this process being in place, there's something wrong here, and I'm going to use my judgment now to jump into the situation and take the risk of not being efficient to potentially save this life. And that's what I want to talk about today, this kind of how do we both handle being efficient, but also building structures where we open windows for dynamic quality, as I'm going to call it, to come in and tell us, wait a minute, you need to use your judgment here. You're becoming a slave to the process. You're using lazy sense-making. And oftentimes, we're holding ourselves back because no one else has said anything. I think that statistics show that around only 20 people will be the first to speak up if they think something's wrong or fishy, or maybe this solution isn't going to work, but everybody seems so keen on it. I don't want to be the one that's coming across as negative, so I keep my mouth shut, right? I have the disfortunate pleasure of being in that 20%, partially due to I'm neurodivergent, so sometimes I have a tendency to say things that other people wouldn't say out loud. And what I've noticed about this is that when I say these things out loud, I have clusters of people coming up to me after meetings going, I'm so glad you said that. I was thinking the same thing. And I'm like, you know what? It would be really helpful if you would take some of the social cost of this as well and also use your voice from time to time. So I would like to advocate for us to build mechanisms in that we can actually learn the difference between when we want to be efficient and when we want to actually open windows for dynamic quality. Because as we've probably seen this cartoon before, we all kind of logically know that our linear reasoning, when we go into a room and try to say that something's going to go from A to B, isn't always valid, right? We know that reality is more complex than what we want to draw up on the diagram, but we all also would be the ones going in this room and drawing the linear plan, right? We would all be able to live in both worlds. And so we need to be able to straddle that line. Now, efficiency, one of the reasons it serves us is because when we're making sense in our brains, we have to be able to filter. We have to, otherwise we have millions of neurons firing every second, right? So we have different ways we filter, and a lot of people talk about this through the lens of bias, and I do too, but today I'm not, because but bias automatically has a negative spin to it, like, oh, you're biased, let's all try to not be biased, but actually bias is very beneficial. Bias helps us conserve energy. And it causes us, but we have biases related to potential, for example. If someone's talking, we're making snap judgments on whether or not we trust them, if we think the solution's going to come from them. And there was some statistics done by Dana Kanzi that showed, she took thousands of pitch decks from startups founders, and it showed that when a female founder is presenting a pitch deck, the same pitch deck as a male founder, the female founders are asked 70% questions that are prevention questions, and male founders are asked 70% promotion questions, which shows us that, and that's from both male and female, by the way, questioners. That shows us that people are judging potential, because when you ask a prevention question, you're putting someone in a position to prove that they're not going to screw up. Whereas if you ask a promotion question, you're putting someone in a position to tell you how they're going to make it awesome. We also have biases and energy conservation due to experience. We defer to experience. So even in Sweden, or I could say Denmark, where they really like having this idea of a flat hierarchy, I'm not sure how it works in Sweden, but in Denmark they have an illusion that they have flat hierarchies. And but they actually, in my opinion, don't. They have shadow hierarchies because everyone's deferring their power to people who have a different position or that has more experience associated with it. We've got biases related to expertise. This one's really critical. I put the ship there because if you think about the longitude problem, I don't know who's familiar with the longitude problem. For many years, ships were crashing because we didn't actually know longitude, we knew latitude. And the way we figured out latitude was by looking at the stars. But it became so urgent to figure out longitude because ships were wrecking and killing everybody that the King of England said, whoever can figure this out gets a lot of money. And everyone was looking at the stars. Everyone was looking for astronomers to tell them the answer. So when a watchmaker came with a solution, they kind of laughed at him and didn't think it was possible, because they were expecting the solution to come from an astronomer. But it came from a watchmaker. We also defer our power. There's been tons of linguistic analysis of plane crashes that even if the co-pilot knows they're about to crash, they don't speak up to the pilot right next to them, because they don't want to step on his or her toes, because it's not their power position. So there's all these different ways our efficiency is there to conserve energy, but it also gets us in trouble. We also, as humans, have a tendency to tell stories about everything to ourselves. We, of course, tell stories culturally. That's one of the #1 ways humans transfer knowledge, actually, is through storytelling. But we actually tend to make up stories ourselves about causality. We really like to make sense of causality. So whether you're conscious of it or not, when situations are happening, we're almost all the time telling stories to ourselves about why they're happening. And oftentimes we're forgetting to check if that's true or not. And we're also choosing to make up stories about other people. If somebody looks at you a certain way, you make up a story about, oh, maybe they don't like me. I do this all the time. I make up stories about what I think is happening without asking people what's going on in your head right now. And this is very important as well to what we're about to talk about with dealing with complexity. So, because when we start to socialize these stories that we tell, and we start to check our biases and our filters, it becomes a lot more difficult. I drew this cartoon because it reflected what I was seeing at work, that everybody says they want people to speak up. But then when they do start speaking up, it gets categorized as noise. I don't know if you use this term in Sweden, but in Denmark, on all the projects I work on, basically every group of people who's been saying the risk that ends up destroying our project has been dismissed as noise, which is why I've written a book called The Opposite of Noise. So that is the reality is a lot harder to deal with. So Peter Senge defined creative tension as the gap between the current reality and a future envisioned possibility. And this creative tension is what drives us to innovate and to solve problems. It's really easy to picture your own creative tension. You're sitting with, at any given time, your version of reality, possibly your vision of what future would look better. This could be on any level. It could be like, what's wrong with the world? It could also be like, how do I solve this problem right in front of me right now? This is all creative tension. It gets much more complicated when you start trying to share creative tension with other people, and you start to realize that there's multiple versions of reality, there's multiple visions for possibility, and when you start trying to create something that moves between them, and these probably feels familiar because it's the same concepts Agile was founded on, is that you need to start checking and learning and doing this kind of double loop learning between the realities and possibilities and understanding the different possibilities. So here you could see this multiple realities as like understanding your user community from a software perspective, understanding the problem space, and also trying to understand the possibilities and the constraints in the future. And then I put tension in the middle because what I find that tension is a core catalyst for working from working with a collective creative tension. And why I put tension there is because it often shows up as disagreement or friction or even fights. In my corporate jobs, it shows up as two departments that don't want to talk to each other. And they've made up stories about each other that they suck for whatever reason. And in reality, they probably don't really suck that bad. They probably have a different story and a different reality and a different reason for doing what they're doing and some causality that you don't know about. So now we know the phrase, right, that the map is not the territory. And then, of course, if you get to a place where the map isn't accurate, follow the territory, right? So I've been watching this show on Netflix with my 9-year-old son, You versus the Wild. Anybody seen it? It's really, really fun. But Bear, as the man is named, gets dropped into all kinds of wild situations and has to survive. And he tells the viewers that when you're in the wild and you're having to survive, you have two options. You need to either stay put and conserve energy. This is what he calls being static and hoping you're going to get rescued and build yourself a fire and do your best. Or you have to be dynamic and you have to try to go searching for whatever, a way out, searching for a road if you're in a jungle, searching for a clearing where you can build a campfire to try to get a helicopter's attention, whatever. And I like his framing because it is constantly a decision. When do we want to be static in this moment and follow the process? Do we feel like the process is serving us? Are we actually moving towards a shared intention coherently? Or is it time to be dynamic and have somebody be bold enough to say, hey, wait a minute, do we actually even like this? There have been game-changing moments in my career as a consultant, just watching teams go, wait a minute, is this even what we're supposed to be doing? That is a game-changing question. So I'm curious if you could give some thought to how in your life, it could be at work or whatever, do you make a decision between sticking to the plan or using your courage to say, wait a minute, and being dynamic? And if you want to take about 5 minutes, I thought it could be fun for you to just turn to your seatmate and have a little conversation around how do you decide when to be efficient and when to be dynamic? Okay? Do you understand the question?
bil i 3 månader innan jag fyllde 14. Och den rörande säkerhet. Nu måste vi göra det. Punkt. Nu löser vi det.
Det tog 2 timmar. Eller kom bara liksom reda ut det, eller vadå?
Ja, men reda ut hur de skulle kunna komma fram till 2 ERS på en minut.
Ja.
I slutet så löste de inte det.
Ja. Det var inte så stor grej egentligen.
Nej. Det var bara att ingen visste hur man skulle göra det. Ingen individ visste. Men när de jobbade som grupp, då kunde de lösa det. Och då fick de en stor realisation att vad fan vänta nu, vi kan ju lösa det, vi kan bättre bara vi sitter ihop och gör det.
Okay, if you would like to conclude your chat. And I wish we had time to have you all share, but we are going to continue, and then I hope you'll feel free to share later if you're interested. So I want to jump into trying to understand, kind of from a scientific perspective, which contexts are more appropriate for efficiency and which contexts are more appropriate for what I'm going to put up against is variability. Because if you remember that the equation for efficiency was the output divided by the total input, so the quality output divided by the total input. So if you want the total input to be as low as possible to create an efficient situation, you want to reduce variation on the input. So if you think about that from a noise perspective, it's about reducing the amount of ideas and opinions that are slowing you down from continuing your process. So Daniel Kahneman is, of course, quite famous for all the work he did around, in Thinking Fast and Slow, about our biases, but also he wrote a book called Noise, and he defines it as unwanted variability in judgments where we expect uniformity. And this last part of the sentence is very important because a lot of people take Kahneman's work out of context. And this is also why I called my book The Opposite of Noise, not to contradict Kahneman, but to point out that he's talking about different contexts than complexity. And Kahneman himself, in interviews, made this very clear that there are plenty of contexts where we need variation. So it's not all contexts where we want to exclude variation. So noise is only variation in contexts where we don't want it. And it can actually be really damaging. Again, back to the operating room, having everybody's opinions thrown in can be very dangerous. But variety is necessary for quality, innovation, and evolution. So in order for something to grow and evolve in nature, living systems need to be introduced with a difference in the environment, learn from that difference, and then build from that. So that's the process of natural selection. And for quality to happen, there needs to be a relationship between the subject and the object. You could read that as it can be between the solution and the problem. And to be able to maintain this relationship, it means that you're basically managing an interface, which when you have a lot of those becomes very difficult, borderline impossible if you have too many of them. So complexity can be extremely damaging if you're trying to be efficient. And the first reaction somebody wants to do with complexity then is get rid of it. And in some cases, you can do it in smart ways, like we learned already, like modularize things, build fewer interfaces, make fewer boundaries that need to be negotiated through relational conversations and things like that. But you also need to be able to bring variation together to be able to come up with new ideas. The majority of innovations that happen now aren't by some wild genius sitting in a lab discovering something. It's through combining unexpected things. So to be able to do that, you need to combine disciplines. You need to be able to combine, in an organization, you need to be able to combine departments. But of course, it's not easy to invite everybody to meetings, so you have to be efficient. So what I'm hoping to what I'm talking about here is trying to figure out how to balance that in a clever way. And on top of that, you need to be able to access this dynamic quality to be able to have breakthroughs. And what I mean here by breakthroughs are building solutions that aren't actually just wrong, which is what we see happening a lot in the corporate world, solutions that don't resonate with users. It's an easy and cheap excuse to say it's just because people are opposed to change. And I'm quite honest, tired of hearing it, because most of the people I know are actually thirsty for change and hungry for change. We're actually opposed to really stupid changes that keep getting pushed down from leaders that are disconnected from the people who are actually doing the work. I'm sorry, but that's the experience that I have. So I don't appreciate trying to be hired as a consultant to help manage people's change resistance. I'd rather spend time trying to help people understand who they're creating solutions for, what their customers need, etc. So I think of dynamic quality as like fresh air, and sometimes you can literally feel it. I can actually feel it in my body, that there's like a suffocation, that there's been that you feel like there's no fresh air in a room. It's the same feeling when you're in a meeting, and it's like the thing that needs to be said isn't being said. To me, it literally feels in my body the same as sitting in a room and feeling suffocated when you need to open a window. So I use this metaphor. We need to open a window for dynamic quality. And the Cynefin framework, I think, gives us the best framework that I know of to this day to help us understand the context where variation is useful and where it's not useful. I won't spend time. You can go to master's courses on this, and I have, and we could teach long courses on it, but if you're curious about it, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room already know about it, this is what I use to try to make sense of where does the variation make sense and not. And to be really quick about it, on the right side of the Cynefin framework, you've got what you consider ordered systems. And in ordered systems, you want to have ordered responses. So you would like to reduce variation there. In complicated settings, reducing variation is golden because you get the experts, you get the process up to speed, and then you're going. In a complex situation, that's where you want to actively engage with variety dynamically, also with the intent to move something into the ordered state, so kind of like a cycle, not to just grapple with complexity forever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're solving the complex problem. According to most systems thinkers, you don't solve complexity. You can create solutions that help different parts of a complex system, but oftentimes Nora Bates and the other systems thinker that I've studied under would say that a lot of the problems we're in with the world right now, is due to trying to solve complex problems with reductive solutions, because what you end up doing is creating another problem somewhere else in the system that you didn't incorporate into the design. So this is what I use to get a gauge for what I'm dealing with. And to make it even more difficult, reality is always a blend of all of this. So it's never like you just go to work one day and today I'm going to deal with complexity and tomorrow I'm going to have an ordered day and everything's going to be ordered and that's going to be great. So we need to be able to kind of use the different sense-making styles simultaneously and have the discretion to know the difference and do that with other people. So it's really hard and inefficient. But understanding what you're doing helps make it more efficient. So here's some techniques for dynamic sense-making. When you decide, when it's you versus the wild, you decide you're going to use your dynamic sense-making, here's some tips and tricks I have. You want to seek out relevant variety. This comes from the law of requisite variety, which is the #1 law of cybernetics by Ashby. And the law states that only variety destroys variety. So when you're trying to meet complexity, you need to actually meet it with the same level of complexity that created it, which means if you're trying to solve a difficult, complex problem at work, and you have really annoying stakeholders that won't shut up and are making a lot of noise, you probably want to invite them in and listen to them and understand their perspective and understand it doesn't mean you have to, and I know I'm in Sweden where I hear, at least in Denmark, that the Swedes are even more collaborative than the Danes. But at least it's also my perception that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Swedes are really good at also converging on something after collaborating and trying to get consensus. And I haven't seen that happening in Denmark yet. But you want to seek out relevant variety, but with the intention to still converge on something, but you want to hear representation from all the perspectives that possibly, and you can't be perfect on this, but usually what I do is if I start hearing noise from a certain department, bring somebody from that department in. Engage with problems and solutions simultaneously. Again, the linear design process tells us we should just figure out the problem and then get an expert to solve it. And oftentimes problems are given to me as a consultant that were scoped out by like 2 leaders that decided that this is what reality is and that they want this to be the solution. And that's not how it should be if you're trying to work with complexity. You need to, if you find something out in the solution process that helps you understand the problem better, you need to be willing to, like Agile suggests, learn and adapt. You want to connect the unexpected. So you want to bring people in who possibly would surprise you, like a watchmaker if you're trying to figure out longitude. But how would you know this? You don't, because it's unexpected. But you need to create the conditions where unexpected voices can be heard. So when someone comes up to you in the hallway with a wacky idea, even if you want to think, oh my God, they're so annoying, they need to leave me alone, it could be useful to listen. I'm not saying you have to do what they say, but then if you start to hear 7 voices saying something similar, it might be that you become curious to see, why is everybody talking about this thing? I'm going to try to look into it. Another weird, unexpected thing that I've learned recently to lean into is the obvious. People are sometimes thinking, since they're having such a hard time solving something, that that means that the solution's going to be really difficult or really crazy hard. But most of the best solutions I've seen recently are super obvious once we figure them out. And it's because we've rescoped the problem. And then, of course, be efficient where you can. So you want to constantly be thinking about, all right, we're being dynamic here. We're trying to figure out how to get to the bottom of this. But we have these decisions that have been made. Let's use those as enabling constraints. We have this knowledge. We have data. Let's use those as enabling constraints. You don't want to contradict science, for example. You've got scientific proof of something. Let's use that. This isn't about everybody that happens to want to have an opinion about something should jump into a room and whoever is there gets to decide the answer because we're navigating complexity. There are people who practice that, and I think it's actually quite dangerous. You need to also bring the data and bring the knowledge you have and let it be an enabling constraint in the divergent process. So we need to develop this discretion to know the difference. So imagine you're in the wild, you're going to be static, or you're going to be wild and go try to find a road. And we need to try to have a shared language. And I can't tell you what that shared language is going to be because your teams are so different and your situations are so different. And I personally believe one of the things that went wrong with scaled agile is people became so obsessed with trying to predict up front what everyone should do by making all these rituals and things that it just became that people became fixated on, we have to do the ritual this way, and then someone else worked at a different company, they think it should be done differently, and then they start arguing about that. But you and your team need to decide what works best for you and figure out how you're going to open windows for dynamic quality to come in. And that's going to have to be specific. We can, of course, discuss, and that's what we're going to do now, what those windows could be, whether you're using Scrum, Agile, or Prince2, or maybe you're not even working on a project at all, but you have to solve problems, or you're an engineer. So I was thinking we would do another share and pair for 5 minutes, where you discuss what rituals, if you already do this, which rituals do you use, or which rituals can you imagine yourself using to prompt or invite in dynamic action. And I think we saw one earlier in your Blitz talk where you had these cartoon characters that you said that you would have them say, go closer to the circle if you think the quality is good, and go away from it if you think it's bad. I saw that as an invitation to open a window and say, oh, now I don't have to out myself as the disgruntled one that disagrees. I have a safe space where I can indicate my dynamic quality or my opinion about the solution. So that's a great example. So let's take 5 minutes to do a quick share and pair, maybe with a new person if you feel so inclined. If not, you do you. And we'll meet back in 5.
Ja, vad härligt. Ska vi fråga? första rutan upp till vänster det beskriver du precis vad du tror det första du kommer tänka på. Sen delar vi den där. Så nästa ruta är okej, ska du fortsätta med samma idé eller har du hittat någon annan? Det är liksom, jag gillar gruppaktiviteter för att ta reda på det där som inte riktigt, där man inte vet någonting. För det som grupp kan man ju hitta saker och ting som jag aldrig skulle tänka som vi. Det är därför jag tycker att grupparbete är det är ju förutsättning. Nej, det är inte. Men däremot kan du bygga på.
Jag jobbar mycket genom åren med design sprint-metoderna som är veckor och sprinter. Man gör problembeskrivning till idéer, till koncept, till prototyp och test på en vecka. Så de är ju fantastiska. Hjälpa att strukturera ett sätt.
Så då behöver du ha dina bra hypoteser.
Du måste ha rätt typ av problem att applicera. Det får inte vara för enkelt och det får inte heller bli lösa.
Bara gör. Jag brukar säga ett uttryck som jag hittade, jag kommer inte ihåg exakt vad jag fick det från, men fail fast. I terms av att, gå en riktning. Vet du inte vad du ska göra, men gå en riktning bara. Låt det där faila. Sen utvärdera, okej, det gick inte, vi tar nästa. Men då vet vi i alla fall att det är inte. Så då vet vi mer än vad vi visste igår. Och sen så fail fast för att hitta något.
Ja, men det är ju Silicon Valley-sättet att säga prototyping. Eller engineering-språket för design. Men det är ju superbra. Förutom att det lät fel tolkat sätt. Men jag vill inte misslyckas. Det är ju inte det. Man söker ju. Ja, men exakt. Man söker ju efter svar.
Hylla fel. Så nu lärde vi oss någonting.
Ja, men exakt.
Men det lyckas jag rätt från början. Jag fast en lärde då inte.
Precis, men det är det som är felet. Om man tar det språket in i något som inte är dynamiskt, alltså det är då det blir så här, ja men i hjärttransplantation är det inte misslyckas.
Nej.
Exakt. Precis, exakt. Kan vi avsluta det snabbare?
Det är lite fel. Alla andra gånger. Absolut.
All right. Let's wrap it up. Okay, thank you for that. And now I'm going to wrap up by sharing some of the rituals that I use as a window for dynamic quality. So I usually am running Prince 2 kind of projects. Right now, working with kind of big pharma, but I also use Scrum rituals. But essentially, what I try to do is find ways to, in advance, for example, in a steering committee meeting, discuss with the steering committee that we're going to create a space where we can have difficult conversations. One of the phenomenons I've watched happen in steering committee meetings is that oftentimes project managers think that they can only go into steering committee meetings with, everything being green, like the watermelon KPI is red in the middle, green on the outside, and trying to prove to the steering committee that everything's under control. And steering committee members also kind of create the conditions for this behavior because they often come across as very disconnected. They want answers. They want you to come with solutions, not problems. But I do find that there's a middle road if you have a relationship with the steering committee where you say, I am going to come to you sometimes with problems that I don't have solutions for, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to structure these problems so that I give you, in a structured way, information that we do have, or I'm going to bring, for example, a trade-off. A lot of the situations I work in have major trade-off choices that are having to be made on a daily basis. For example, companies that want to standardize and innovate simultaneously. Have you tried that? It's really fun. It requires completely two different behavior sets, but doing it simultaneously means that you sometimes eventually come to a trade-off decision that is above your head to make, and companies lack mechanisms often to make these trade-off decisions in a structured way. So I tell the steering committee meeting up front that we're going to bring these mechanisms into the meeting, and we're not going to do it in a wild way. We're not going to come in and just start complaining. We're going to still be structured about it. We're going to write down what we know about the problem, what we see as the decision point, what we see as the pros of each decision point, and then what we want, what kind of decision we want from them. Oftentimes, steering committee members tell me, I wish people would be more clear about what they're asking me to decide about, because oftentimes people just think I've made a decision because I asked a question that sounded skeptical, and then next thing you know, they think I don't like something, and they've ran off and done something differently. And then when they have their decisions projected back to them, they're going, I don't even think I made that decision, much less did I have the context needed to make the decision. So we need to help the steering committee have this. And create this space where you can have these difficult conversations in a structured way. The other process I use is the risk and issue process. Risk management, I've also played a role being the risk manager on the most expensive project in Danish history, and it was really quite fun. We got to go and try to collect risks all over the world and quantify them, but then on top of that, I've created an emergent risk process where you need to also look for pre-quantitative risks. So a lot of risk management practices only recognize quantitative risks. So if you can't quantify it, it's not a risk. That is the mantra. But scientifically, there are phenomena that emerge that are pre-quantitative. It's a fact. So how do you find these qualitative risks? Well, it's, again, not back to just listening to everybody in the hallway and hoping that they're accurate, but looking for patterns in the narrative in the hallway. And there are ways to do that, and one of the ways to do it is to start tracing causality back more than one level. So most risk matrices have causality be one level back. It's also useful to go 2 levels back, 3 levels back. Then you start realizing you're in a multi-causal system, which is a complex system, and it's important to start looking for patterns in the qualitative data to try to also do experiments and things like that to try to improve the patterns. So that's very important. And you also can couple that with the quantitative to make everybody happy with their numbers. And then in the solution design, and we've talked a lot about that, but you want to bring together the most, we actually heard about what Elon Musk is doing at scale. He said, they're collecting the user data at scale to understand the user experience in real time. We don't have the technology, most of us, to do that in our jobs, but we can still bring a range of the user perspective into the conversation to try to understand the problem. I saw this in the corporate world, but I also see it in the startup world as well. I had a team of students developing a mechanism for a cow to improve the cow's health for a whole semester, and I kept pushing them. They had never been on a farm. They had never seen a cow except from the side of the street. I kept pushing them to talk to a farmer, to go meet cows, to understand how this mechanism works with the cow. And sure enough, as soon as they did that, they had to rescope their whole problem because they realized all the things they thought cows might be concerned about isn't what they were concerned about. The farmer's number one concern was actually how to know when his cow can get pregnant. And they were looking at the same kind of data you'd look at for a human to see if they're fit or something. So it's important to understand your user no matter what it is. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And I have brought copies of my freshly published book, and this is actually the first time they're available. And I've got them out there in the lobby for sale if you would like to swing by and get one. There's a Swish account set up, and we've put them at 250 Swedish kronors, which is 35% less than the retail price. And also, I love chatting and continuing the conversation on LinkedIn, so please feel free to connect with me or grab a coffee with me over there and ask me your questions or give me your perspective or challenge me. Thank you very much.